We're going to talk, the title of this talk is I've seen Grails code you couldn't believe, or how to properly write maintainable Grails applications. Before going into any details about the talk, I'm going to introduce myself really quickly, because I think you know me. I'm Iván López. I'm a member of the Grails team at OCI. I also organize the Groovy group here in Madrid, and I'm one of the guys behind this conference. And that's all I'm going to say. If you want to talk to me after this talk, please come and talk. And before I start this talk, I want to show you, I have a disclaimer for you, and I want to read it. So this is a true story. The events that pick in this talk took place in some projects in 2017. At the request of the survivors, the names have been changed. Out of respect for the dead, the rest has been told exactly as this occurred. And this is really important because this is actually true, right? This is not like Fargo. So at the request of the survivors, all the names have changed. This means that all the names, classes, variable, methods, everything that you are going to see have been changed. But out of respect for the dead, I'm telling exactly the truth as it occurred. Okay? So over the years, I've created a lot of Grails applications, and I've learned a lot of things that works and don't work. I've also seen a lot of code that could have been done in a different way to make it more readable, maintainable, easy to test, easy to modify. So the idea behind this talk is to show you a lot of examples of how not to do things, explain why that particular code is not so good, and how you can improve that code and why does it matter. I'll be happy if after this talk, you go home, you go work next week, and change how you develop your applications. And don't worry and don't be ashamed if you see something here that you are actually doing. So this is not about blaming people. The point is to learn why these are not the best practices, the best approaches, and just learn about how to avoid that things, right? Another disclaimer, I don't have the magic recipe to write better code automatically. So pretty much in most of the cases, or in all of the cases, we, the developers, need to do the effort to do the things right. So everyone knows that the larger a class is, the better, right? So in this first example, I'm going to show you one of the things that you'd never do. This is a class. This is from a controller, a Grails controller. And the first thing that you can see here is that there are 15 beans injecting, meaning 15 dependencies. And the worst thing is that this class has almost 4,000 lines of code, which is way too much, right? So this is because you have a lot of dependencies, and you put everything here in the controller. And we don't do that. We shouldn't do that. You don't need to have a user controller or whatever, car controller, and put everything there. You can create more classes. User detail controller, car details, car whatever. It's free to create new classes, right? So please don't do this. And what can be better than a 4,000 lines of code, a class? Well, a very large method. So this is an index, the index action, of that controller, and it has 238 lines of code, which maybe is not too much. You are thinking, well, it's not too much. But let me show you a few stats about this particular method. In this code, there were 41 if branches and 16 L branches. But it's going to be better. There were up to 5 nested if levels. So you have one if, and another, and another one. 5 nested ifs. There were 19 service calls in that action to do anything. 12 dynamic finders to get some data from the database. 87 access to params. And the last but not the worst, it's the best, is that there were 0 tests. Because, it's impossible to test that code. Think how many tests do you need to write if you want to test all those 41 if branches. You can't. It's impossible. So please don't do this. And continuing with this series, the larger the better, we have the larger a setup method in a test, the better, right? If you use a Spock, and you should use a Spock for your test, you know that the setup method is shared between all the tests or all the tests in that specification file. So this is a test for a controller. And the first thing that I saw when I was reading this code was like this. It seems that they were injecting services in that test. But as you know, in a unit test, we don't have dependency injection. So all those services will be null. Then you continue reading the code. You have this setup method. And here in this first part, all that code was to initialize objects or things that you need for your test. So imagine that you need a user, a car, a book, author, whatever you need, they were put in there. So all those objects were available for all those tests. And then, in this part, they were mocking all those dependencies in the same way. This means that for all the tests in that file, the dependencies are going to be mocked exactly the same. And maybe you are thinking, well, it's not that bad, because maybe there are only 5 or 10 tests in that class, right? The thing is, there were 129 tests in that class. And for all those 129 tests, all the initial data and all the injected beans or services were mocked in the same way. And I don't know you, but when I test code, I need different behavior for my collaborators. Sometimes I need to just return an empty list, return an object, throws an exception. So I need different behavior. And with that approach, having everything on the setup, you can't do that because it's shared with all your tests. Okay? So how we can detect all those problems? The first thing is that if you can't test the code, or if it is too complicated to test the code, you will have something like a warning, a yellow flag saying, maybe this code is not very good because I can't test it. Another thing is that your IDE is slow. Opening that 4,000 lines controller on IntelliJ takes time, but then IntelliJ needs to read the file, get all the metadata from the methods, variables, everything. So every time I open that file, my CPU went to 100%, and it takes time. So if your CPU is always 100%, maybe you have problems with your classes. And then you have big setup method with a lot of dependencies. So if you see that, you need to think about how to fix it or how to change it. How do we fix this? Just write smaller classes. It's free. We don't need to pay 500 or 5 euros per class that we write. It's free. Just create a new class, and you're done. So do that, right? It's better to have a lot of classes, but small classes with a small behavior, a small functionality that just a very big one class. And also write small methods. Write small method with good names, create private methods, helpers, whatever you want, but don't put anything on a 200 lines and controller action. And then write a small, or even better, non-existent shared test code. So the setup method should be really, really small, or even better, you shouldn't have to use the setup method, or only for really, really something like infrastructure things, but not to mock all your dependencies. And why does it matter? Because we want to write clean and maintainable code. And in all those examples, all that code wasn't clean and wasn't maintainable at all. It was a nightmare to modify that. And again, you should be able, because you want to test your code, right? And with that code, it's impossible to test it. That's why in that controller action, there were any tests, because it's impossible to test that, right? So let's continue with the next example. You all know that the fastest way to solve a problem is just copying and pasting everything without thinking twice. And you have extra points if you copy that from Stack Overflow without really understanding, right? We've done that. So this is a constraint method from a domain class, a Grails domain class. And this is how it looks, pretty much the same. And let me help you to focus on the real important part, which is this one. Right? So they were using the same custom validator to validate the length of the field, and if it was greater than some value, they were just returning that error. And maybe you are thinking again, okay, Iván, it's not that bad. It's the same code in 5 places in the same class, so we can live with this, right? You can't, because that code was used in 14 files, in 14 domain classes, and 30 times. So this is a problem, and what I did to solve this thing was creating a class, a helper class, custom validator. You can call it whatever you want, just a Groovy class. You define a static method, and then inside that static method, you just return the closure with your validator. That's all, and then you can use it on your domain classes, like this. So now you have all the logic in one place. You don't need to modify 30 classes every time you decide that that validation is not enough, or you can change the error message or whatever you want. So how to detect these problems? When you see a lot of duplicated code. If you see that, think twice, or maybe think, OK, how can we solve this? Or maybe we can try to figure out how to refactor or do something else with this code. So how do we fix it? Just don't repeat yourself. And I use this rule. So if I need to copy and paste the code more than 2 times, then I extract, refactor, and reuse. I keep this number because sometimes it's better to have just a small duplication on your code base than creating the wrong abstraction. So sometimes you are not sure about how the code will be in a few time. So you can have a few duplication, because maybe in a month you will have a clear picture of how to do that. So it's not that bad. But for that example, it's obvious that you should have done that. And why does it matter? Because we only need to change, or we only want to change the code in one place. And because we want to reuse the code, right? And if we copy and paste the code, we are not reusing the code. This is one of my favorite things, because being a Ruby developer is so fun and easy that you don't even need to think about types, right? You can just use def everywhere, because YOLO, you only live once. So who cares about types? So then you see this is a method from a service. And then you see in the signature that everything is final, which is it's good. But what about the types? So, and I can assure you that in this particular project, this item instance theme, or the original theme, remember this is a true story, but I'm changing everything. There wasn't a concept named item. That thing didn't exist on that project, but they were naming it item instance. Then you have current params, well, and then current user, this is probably a Spring Security user. Then you will see the return type. It's def, so who knows? Boolean, an item instance, true, null, whatever you want. And then you have all these variables are initialized just after the signature, and you don't know about the type. So maybe action list or a status list, they are lists, probably, I hope. But and also the default value was very wrong, because for a list you should use an empty list instead of null, because you will have null pointer exceptions. So how to detect this kind of code? With code reviews. It's really important to have code reviews, because maybe you have a bad day or whatever, you were not aware, because you have everything on your mind when you were writing the code, so you thought, OK, def everywhere is fine. But then when one of your colleagues is reviewing your code, that colleague needs to really understand your code. And without types, he can or she can't. How will you fix it? Always write your method signatures as in Java. So we don't like Java because we are Ruby developers, but having types is really, really important. So use the types always in method signatures. And if for local variables, if the type is not obvious, just write it. It's not a problem. So if you are doing dev user equals new user, maybe it's fine. But if you are dealing with a third-party API or with another part of code that you are not sure what that method will return, just put the types. No one will blame you for using types. They will blame you for using dev because they don't understand the code. And why does it matter? Because we want to be able to read the code. And in the previous example, all those 10 lines of code were dev, so we don't know anything about those types. And that code wasn't readable. We also want to help our IDE to help us. With types, we have refactors, we have auto-completion, we can use the IDE for search. But without types, even using IntelliJ, it's complicated. So use types to help the IDE to help you. And also to help your future you and your team to read your code. Because if you are in a big project, and you start using dev everywhere, in 2, 3, 4 months, you won't be able to maintain that code. It will be a real nightmare, OK? OK, this is like dev everywhere, but with strings. So why do you need types when you can store anything you want in a string? You can store a date, you can store a Boolean, you can store a number. So using a string everywhere is right, because we can store whatever we want, right? So in this particular project, I'm looking for 2 concepts, main core concepts in that project, and they were using 65 times and 55 that string in all the code. So every time they needed to access that kind of core thing, they put it on quotes, on a string. And this is wrong. So how you can detect that? Again, code reviews. Code reviews is really important to have always code reviews. And CodeNarc. There are a rule to detect this kind of magic strings. So you can use, if you want to learn more about CodeNarc tomorrow, if you want to learn more about CodeNarc, there is a lightning talk tomorrow about it. It's just, CodeNarc is a Groovy static analysis of code. How do we fix these strings everywhere? Just using an enum or using constants, and that's all. In any place that you need to use that magic string, just use the constant. Or if you have different values, create an enum. User active, inactive, deactivated, not enabled, whatever you think. And if you use enums, write helper method, a static method inside the enum to have to expose method to check all the status that you want with your enum. So you don't need to, or you shouldn't, something like expose those values. If you want to check if a user is active, instead of executing user.status equals enum.active, just use enum.isUserActive, and you pass the user, right? Because you have everything in that place. You don't need to have all those kind of logic spread all over your code. Why does it matter? Because we want to find the usages of those constants. And if you have an enum or a constant, you can do that. But with a string, it's really complicated. And because we want to refactor the code. And with that, we can do it. And we will be able that we are modifying everything, or we see in all the places that that specific constant is used. But again, with the strings, it's complicated, right? This is another pattern that I've seen a lot. And it happens because it's really simple in Grails or with Groovy, write just a dynamic finder, for example, and execute a query to the database in every place in the application. So folks do it every time they need it, and just they use it, and they don't think twice about, okay, I just need user.find all by last name. And if I need it here, I use it, and if I need it in another place, I just write the same query over and over again. And the problem is that you have this example, so I'm looking for find all or find by in all the services, and there were almost 400 occurrences. And maybe you are thinking that this is good because you should put your business logic on services, so this is not that bad. The problem with that particular project was that all these kind of queries, so simple dynamic finders, user, find all by ID or find all by last name or whatever, were spread all over the code, the same query again and again. But it gets worse, and you shouldn't do that because this means that you are going to the database to get something, and your business logic shouldn't be on controllers. And finally, they were using dynamic finders in GSPs, meaning that when you are rendering the HTML, you go to the database to get some data, which is absolutely wrong. So please don't do that, okay? How to detect this pattern? Code reviews again. I'm going to use that because I remember my second disclaimer. I don't have a magic recipe to write good code. You need to put on your side, okay? How do we fix this? Create a new layer. You can call it repository service, call GORM service, whatever you want. And in this kind of special services, so they are just Grail services, but in these services, you are only allowed to access database in these services, right? It doesn't matter if it's just a dynamic finder, a safe, or a complicated criteria. Always put your database logic, your database access, in that layer, in that service repository service layer. And this matters because we want to decouple our code from persistence. And here I'm not talking about removing GORM in the future. I'm just talking about having all the database code in one layer because we can or we should do integration tests for that repository service layer to make sure that all our persistence is working. But then, in the rest of our code, when I need to access the database and call one of my repository services, the only thing I need to do is just mock that service and return whatever thing I need. An empty list, a user, a library, a book, anything. And that's all. And having all the logic, all the database logic in those services, in those special services, allow you to do that, to have separation of concerns and write clean and good code and differentiate between integration and unit tests, because most of your code you can test it with unit tests, which is really fast. Okay, so if you are Java or Ruby developers, and you have experienced a null pointer exception in your life. But yes, life is too short for null pointer exceptions. So what we can do? In Ruby, we have this null safe operator, which is amazing if you use it properly, right? But the thing is that folks don't know how to use it. So let me explain this. The first thing is that they have this book, find by. So book is a domain class. It's a class, so it can be null. But who knows? You put the question mark because maybe the Java compiler, the GUI compiler has a bug. Who knows? I don't know. It can happen. Maybe it happened to those guys. Then they update this. So they go to the database, they get this updated book, and they check with the question mark in the first 3 lines. So they are protecting against null pointer exception, but then they do this update book.refresh without the null safe operator. So if updated book is null, you will have a null pointer exception there, because they forgot to add another question mark. Then we have this catch book status. That thing was a concurrent hash map that was defined in that same class to use something like a cache. And that map was initialized as an empty map. So it can be null, but you never know. And finally, no, not finally, this low level, it's an enum. So again, a class. And full was one of the values, but maybe it's null. And now finally, you define that on the second line, a list, and then you use here again with the question mark, because who knows? And maybe you are thinking that this was only happening in that particular method, because it seems that this method has all the grown things that you can do with the null safe operator, but the null safe operator in this particular project was spread all over the code, right? It was a real nightmare to read that code. So how to detect this? Again and again, code reviews is really important. And you can use CodeNarc. There is this rule, unnecessary safe navigation operator, that will warn you when you are using the null safe operator and you shouldn't. But they were not using CodeNarc. How do we fix this? Just use the question mark, the null safe operator, when a value really can be null. And more important, think twice before using it. So if you are in testing or writing some code and you have a null pointer exception, the first thing that you may try is just, OK, the question mark, and I'm done. But instead of doing that without thinking, you should think twice, because maybe the problem is not in that particular line. Maybe that variable can't be null, and the problem was in the caller method. So if you put here the question mark, you are just hiding a bug in that place of code, in that piece of code. So think twice. Don't just put the question mark without thinking, OK? And this matters because we want to write, again, we want to write easy to read and maintainable code. And if anything on that code can be null, you don't know now. You don't know about that code. It's complicated to read it because, OK, that can be null, that can't. Oh, I'm not sure. OK, next example. I also seen this a lot. So we have in Grails, we have this thing in the controllers, in the actions, called params. Params is something like a map. And we use that maps, or Grails use that map to bind all the parameters from the HTTP request. And the pattern that I see is that we receive the params in the controller, we modify the params, we add, we delete, we do a lot of things, then we pass the params to a service, we modify the params, we do whatever we want, we return the params to the controllers, and then finally we render some response. And this is really, really wrong. In this particular project, they were passing params or using params in services 219 places. And this is wrong because params is a map and it's like a box, right? You have a box, you can put anything you want in that box, and you pass the box to the service. But you only see the box. You can't see what's inside the box. So when you read that method signature, you don't know about the types, about the things that you expect to receive, right? So don't use params for that. For receiving arbitrary HTTP parameters are good, are not that good, but we will see how we can fix it later. But for pass something to service layer, don't do that. So we detect this again with code reviews. If you see a code passing params to service, talk to that colleague and ask why, because maybe it should be another option. We can fix it. The first thing is just don't do it. If you think that you need to pass params to a service, don't do it and think again. And you can use, for example, the first thing is you should use types. So write the types in the signature in the method signature. But if you need to pass more params or something like that, I like to create the static inner classes with the @builder annotation on the service that I want to call. Because with the @builder annotation, I have a really nice way to declare or to define and set all the values that I need as a parameter. And when one of my colleagues see my code and he sees or she sees this whatever input parameter, you can go to the definition and you see, okay, there is a string, an integer, and a date. I really understand what this method accepts and expects without reading the code, right? Because with params, you need to read that method code and say, okay, where is params is used? Okay, params dot user. It's a user, it's a string with the username, I'm not sure. And this matters because we want to decouple, because params belongs to the controller's layer, right? It's a thing that we have in Grails for these parameters to get all the HTTP parameters, and they belong to the controller's layer, and we want to decouple controllers for services. So if we pass params to a service, this means that we cannot call that service from another service, because we don't have params. So we can create a map, which is a box, and put anything there. So it's wrong, so don't do that. And speaking about params, who needs common objects? Because we have params, right? So params for the win, right? No. So for those of you that don't know about a common object is just a Pogo, a plain old Groovy object, that it's annotated with, in all Grails version with a validatable, and in Grails 3, you need to implement the validatable trait. And basically, you use that class as a parameter on a controller action, and Grails will do the data binding and data validation using that class. So here, you can see 2,491 occurrences of params in controllers. And this happens because in this project, they were not using common objects in most of the places. But it's even worse because when they use common objects, they were using it in the wrong way, right? Because common objects should be in the method signature. And you can see that the method signature there doesn't accept a parameter. But then here you have the previous pattern. So you modify params based on another param. You go to the database, you do whatever you want. And then here, you use the common objects in the wrong way. Because you instantiate the common object, you call the main data method, and then you even modify then the values because you are not sure, right? And then finally, you pass the params and the common objects to the service, which is extra points for that code being wrong, right? Because if we just put this vehicle detail command object, vehicle detail command on the method signature, Grails will instantiate the class for us, will do the data binding for us, and we don't need to do anything, right? We don't need to write that code. So, again, and again, and again, code reviews. I don't have the magic recipe. Sorry. How do we fix it? Always use common objects. It's really important. And never use our modified params. Because, again, we have the box. So imagine that you are creating, you have this user form to sign up a user in your application. So you need username, last name, password, date of birth, and 8 different parameters. If you use params on the controller, you don't know about those parameters. You read the code and you only see params. If you create a common object and you define all those parameters, and then in the future you need to read that code, you go to the common object and you see, okay, username is a string, date of birth is a date, age is an integer, whatever you think or you need, right? You can see the types and the values that you expect. Exactly the expected parameters, and even more important is that you can test your data binding and your transformation and all your validations with unit tests in the command object. You don't need to move those tests to the controller, which will be more complicated. You have all that logic related to the param binding and all the details and all the constraints in the command objects. You test that on the command objects, and then on your controller, the only thing you need to do is command dot is valid or command dot has errors. And if has errors, you return an error, and if not, you know that all the parameters are valid. So now you can extract command dot username, command dot whatever. Okay? And everyone knows that the logic belongs to controllers, right? No, it doesn't. You need to put your business logic on services. But what happens is that when you put your business logic on controllers, eventually you will need to save data on the database because your logic is there. And if you need to save data on the database, you need to have a transactional behavior. So you annotate your controller's actions with a transactional, right? And this is wrong. So don't do something like this. In this project, I was looking for a transactional in all the controllers. There were here 208 actions annotated with a transactional, and this means that all those actions have business logic there. So this means that all that code can be reused, can be shared, because it's on a controller. If we move this code to a service, we can reuse it. So we can detect it, again, with code reviews, and we can use CodeNarc. So I think that there is no an out-of-the-box rule, but CodeNarc has this mechanism to create custom rules, and it's pretty simple. So you can create a custom rule to detect the use of a transactional on controllers. And if there is some action annotated with a transactional, CodeNarc should fail and your build should fail. Okay? And you can fix it just moving the business logic where it belongs, and I mean to the services. And the other thing is that if you need to add a transactional to a controller, just don't do it. Move the code to a service where it belongs. And this matters because, as I said, we want to reuse the business logic, and we only can do that if it's on services. In a controller, we cannot do anything. And because the HTTP layer and the controllers belongs to the HTTP layer are not the place for the business logic, right? And it's the same as if you use or pass the HTTP request or the response to the service. If you do that, means that you are coupling the HTTP request with your service. And that service or that specific method can't be reused from another place in your code because you don't have an HTTP session. Or maybe you have because you are passing HTTP requests all over your code, which again is wrong, right? I'm pretty sure that you have heard this. Tests are for people who write bugs, but as I don't write bugs, I don't need to write tests, right? So let me tell you something. You are wrong. You need tests. You need to make sure that your code works, that you can modify it without breaking it, that you can add new features, that you can refactor the code, and everything will work, right? So then you can see this kind of code. This is a screenshot, and the comment is pretty amazing because it says, this is not used yet, should be fine, who knows, but no tests. So this means that you spent time writing this code that you know that is not used, and as you know that is not used, you don't write tests. So what are you doing? Why did you write this code? Okay? And you can see the name of the method doStuff is in light gray. This means in IntelliJ that method was actually not used, so at least the comment was true, right? It's not used, and I can assure you that there wasn't test for that code. So the best thing that you can do, or the best thing that you can do with this code is just delete it. Okay, and you can see the second parameter, incoming params. Yeah, another map. Great. So how we detect this thing? Code reviews and code reviews. And we also have coverage reports. So if we can apply the Cobertura plugin, Gradle plugin, and we can have this code coverage report. So we can open the report and say, okay, why this class has only 12% coverage? Okay, let's fix it. Let's write more tests for this specific class. How do we fix this? If you do TDD, test-driven development, you will always have tests, because with TDD, you write the test before the code. So you have the test. But if you don't like to do TDD, or if you are not very comfortable doing it, it's not a problem. Just write the code, then write the test, and don't push that code until you have tests. Okay? And this matters because we want to modify our code, we want to do refactors, we want to add new features, and without tests, you can't sleep well at night. And I like to sleep well at night. Without being afraid that my last commit, it's going to break production on a Saturday night at 3 a.m., right? And if you are on call, you can thank your colleague next Monday when you are called at 3 a.m. because that code wasn't half test. But in case that you have some kind of doubts or questions regarding if you should write tests or no, I have created a simple decision tree to help you. So, should I write tests? Yes. What if I just need to finish something really fast, to deploy it on a Friday afternoon before going on vacation, and I don't have time to write tests? So in this case, do I need to write tests? Yes. And what if I just, oh my God, write tests? Always, please. Right, it's important. Okay, let's talk about URL mapping. So the default URL mappings in Grails are great because you can just write a controller action and you are done. That action is exposed automatically, right? The thing is that having this, just when you start the project or when you are doing something fast, it's good. But when you have a project with hundreds of controllers, having these default URLs like this, it's a nightmare because you go here to take a look at the URLs, the controllers, and there is nothing. You don't know about the project, about the URL structure. And it's really complicated to have a first picture of a project without the URLs and everything, right? So you detect this again with code reviews. And the best thing that you can do to fix it is just delete the default mapping. This controller action thing, you delete it. And then you write or you create a mapping per application controller. So you just map your URLs to your controller actions. And if you have a lot of them, you can create more URL mappings. So you don't have to put everything on one file. You can create anything you want. User URL mappings, book URL mappings, whatever you want, okay? And this matters because we want to have all the URLs in one place or in 2 or 3 files, but just all there. And we want to make sure that we expose only the things that we want, right? Because if you don't do that, any public method on a controller is exposed by default. And probably this is wrong. And I have here this masterpiece. This is my last example. I've kept the very best for the end because this particular code has so many things wrong that it's amazing. So I'm going to explain really slow because I want you to understand it. So don't worry about the font size because I'm going to zoom in and explain it in a lot of steps. So first, let's pretend we didn't see the signature because it has 7 parameters. So we can probably do another thing. But well, we didn't see that. Then we have this code. It's the same code 6 times. So I'm going to zoom into this line. We have these string companies. And well, the result will be a string, so it's not def, which is good. Then this company list is one of those 7 parameters, and these are list of domain objects, right? So we have in this project companies or regions, subdivision, whatever thing, I don't remember. And here you can see again the abuse of the null safe operator, because if the list is empty, so if you don't have values for that list, you should pass an empty list instead of a null list. So you can skip the null safe operator here if you have an empty list. So we have the list, one of the parameters, and then we here with the .id we are collecting the ID. So basically, if we have a list with 3 companies, in this particular point of code, we have something like this, and a list of longs in this case with the IDs of those domain objects, right? So a list with the 2, the 5, and 7, which are the IDs of these companies. Then we execute .toString. And this, so the first time I saw this code, I was thinking, okay, this can't be true, this can't be true. And then I put a breakpoint, I debugged the code, and I was thinking, oh my God, it's true. Because this toString is not executing a collect. So we are not converting this, the 2, the 5, and the 7 to a string. We are just putting the string representation on the list. And I mean that string. Bracket, the character 2, a comma, a space, a 5, comma, space, 7, and close bracket, okay? That string. And then when you have that string, the next thing you do is, okay, I need to remove the open bracket. Yeah. You know that, but the first time I saw that code, I couldn't believe that. So that's why I debugged that code. You remove that bracket, and you have this. Then, okay, you need to remove the other one, because it doesn't work. So you have this. Then you remove the spaces. So you have 2, 5, 7. And then finally, you trim it, because maybe there is another space. Who knows? Who cares, right? And finally, you do that 6 different times, because you have all those parameters, right? The division, the regions, subdivisions, whatever, right? So this is the first thing you do on the code. Create this kind of strings. Then you continue on the code, and you have this select count as counter from whatever, where. You are using a multi-line string, because who knows? And then you have this same kind of code for all those things, right? So let's focus again on the companies, right? We have this. So the first thing is that, remember, this company list is the variable that you pass on the method signature, a list of domain objects. So here, if you use the Groovy truth, you can write that code simply with if company list. Then we build queries concatenating a string. So what possibly can go wrong? Building queries with strings. And then here we use the values 2, 5, 7 that we calculated in the previous steps, right? And we were doing this in all these 7 examples. Finally, we remove the first and, because imagine that this is a query we are creating with concatenating a string. Select count star as counter from insurance policy condition, where, and company ID, whatever. So this and is wrong. That SQL is not valid. So we remove the first and to make a right SQL sentence. Then we continue with the code, and finally we are going to execute that query. So we check if the statement is null or empty, and it can be null or empty in this case, because we are defining the first part of the statement there. So this if is not necessary. And finally we execute the query, and what happened if all those lists were empty or null? That this is actually the query that we are going to execute. Select count star as counter from whatever, where. And this will fail, right? So this code was, as you can see, very, very wrong. So what I did to refactor this code, well, to refactor, it's not refactor. You can't, or you shouldn't use the word refactor, because refactor means that you have test, and they didn't have test. So I rewrote the code, and I added test. So I kept the signature, because that was used in a lot of places. I don't know why. So I didn't want to change everything. The only thing I changed in the signature was putting an integer, because we are returning the counter. Then I use this domain class dot create criteria count, and inside this criteria, what I did was just this. If company list, then I add in company list. And the same for the other list that we receive in the method signature. And that's all. The only thing I did was using GORM the right way. I didn't concatenate a string and do all those kind of strange code to fix this. And this is way too better, because you use GORM. You don't need to worry about concatenating a string, about nulls, about extracting the IDs. Why? You can use the in clause, right? So how we detect this kind of code? It's impossible to detect it without code reviews, right? And even with that, it takes some time to really understand what's going on. But we can fix it if we teach the developers their tools. In this case, they were probably didn't know that much about Groovy, about Grails, about the languages, about Gorm, so we can teach them, or we need to teach them. Mentoring, we can buy them books, send to conferences, and this matters because we want to write maintainable code, and we want to help our team to grow. So that's all. I hope you enjoy with all those examples and learn something. And I want to finish with this quote: with great powers comes great responsibility, because we are developers and we can make things different. But we just need to make sure that we use our power properly, right? So thank you very much. If you want to learn more, you can go there, guides.grails.org. There are more than 60 guides now with a lot of examples, real examples with repos, with examples to do a lot of things in Grails. In this community, you have the mailing list, the Slack channel. So most of the Grails team, we are on the Slack channel helping folks with questions. You can go to the documentation. In that link, there is the framework documentation, Gorm, views, profiles, the new testing framework, everything. And we also have OCI training, and we are free. There are free webinars every, I don't know, three weeks, a month, something like that. So that was all. Thank you very much. I will post the slides, and if you have something like 30 minutes, please go to that URL on that QR code. It's an anonymous Google form to send me some feedback about the talk. It will only take 30 seconds. It has 4 questions. So if you have 30 seconds, please send me some feedback. And now I'm running out of time, but I think we can have one question. And if you have more questions, we can talk later. I will be around here every time, and we can. So remember that we have the party this afternoon, so we can talk with a beer, which is always better. So if you have some questions, I can take. Where is the mic? I can take at least one. Really?
Gorm methods usually have parameter as well. So what do you recommend to do about that?
Gorm methods, you mean the list or something like that?
If I do like book.list, normally they have a params to have the offsets.
Okay. So for that specific case, what I do is I create something like a pagination param class, which is not a map. It has the offset, the page, the index, whatever parameters you want. And then I create a method to map or build or whatever in which I convert the map. So I pass that method as a parameter. And then in the Gorm thing, I call my pagination params.build or something like that.
Thank you.
And I think that's all. So enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.